Hello everyone, and welcome. Today, let us pause for a moment and ask a question that seems simple on the surface, yet has challenged philosophers for centuries. Can we truly understand what good is if we have never encountered its opposite? This question sits quietly beneath many of our moral beliefs, shaping how we judge actions, people, and even ourselves. It invites us to look not just at the world around us, but at how our minds create meaning. From a human perspective, understanding often comes through contrast. We recognize light because we have seen darkness, value peace because we know conflict, and cherish kindness because we have witnessed cruelty. In this sense, the concept of good does not stand alone. It becomes clear to us only when we can compare it to something else. Without contrast, goodness might exist, but it would feel invisible like air we breathe without noticing. Philosophically, this does not mean that wrongdoing is necessary or desirable. Rather, it suggests that human awareness works through difference. When fairness is the norm, we rarely stop to admire it. It is only when fairness is broken that we suddenly recognize its value. The same applies to honesty, compassion, and trust. These qualities often become most visible at the moment they are missing. This idea explains why moral reflection so often follows moments of loss or failure. Societies tend to question their values after injustice occurs, not before. Individuals often redefine their sense of right and wrong after making mistakes, not while everything feels easy. In this way, contrast acts as a mirror. It does not create goodness, but it reveals it. However, there is an important distinction to make. Saying that people understand good through contrast is not the same as saying the world needs harm in order to function. Philosophers have repeatedly warned against confusing awareness with necessity. The presence of darkness helps us recognize light, but it does not mean darkness must be protected or encouraged. It simply means our perception is shaped by comparison. Ultimately, this raises a deeper question about human growth. Are we capable of recognizing goodness without first being confronted by its absence? Or is contrast an unavoidable part of moral learning at our current stage of understanding? Today's discussion is not about justifying harm, but about exploring how humans come to know what they value most and whether one day, we might learn to recognize goodness without having to lose it first. To continue our journey, let us move one step deeper into how human thinking has traditionally worked. Across many ancient philosophies, the world was understood through pairs of opposites. Day and night, life and death, silence and sound. Meaning was not found in isolation, but in comparison. This way of thinking is often called dualism, and it has shaped how humans understand morality from the very beginning. In this framework, good becomes meaningful only when it stands beside not good. Justice is understood because injustice exists as a reference point. Courage is recognized because fear is real. Without these contrasts, moral language itself begins to lose clarity. Words like kindness, fairness, or responsibility would still exist, but they would feel abstract, almost empty, because there would be no boundary to define them. Ancient thinkers did not necessarily argue that harmful behavior should exist. Instead, they observed how the human mind organizes reality. The brain looks for edges, differences, and contrasts in order to make sense of experience. Just as our eyes need shadow to perceive shape, our moral thinking often relies on contrast to perceive value. This does not make the opposite desirable, but it makes it informative. This helps explain why stories, myths, and teachings across cultures are filled with moral tension. Heroes are defined by the challenges they face, not by calm situations where nothing is at stake. Moral lessons become memorable when they are framed against failure, temptation, or conflict. Without opposition, there is no narrative, and without narrative, moral ideas struggle to stay alive in human memory. Yet, this way of thinking carries a risk. When humans rely too heavily on opposites, they may oversimplify reality. People get divided into good and bad, actions into right and wrong, with little space for complexity. Dualism helps us learn, but it can also limit our understanding if we forget that real human behavior exists on a spectrum. So, idea 2 is not claiming that the world must contain moral opposites to be meaningful. It is pointing out something more subtle. Human understanding has historically depended on contrast. At our current level of awareness, opposites act as tools for comprehension. The challenge for humanity is learning whether we can eventually move beyond strict dualism, recognizing goodness clearly, deeply, and consistently, without needing its opposite to define it. This question quietly prepares us for the next idea, where philosophers begin to ask not how humans perceive good and bad, but whether bad truly exists as something real at all. As we continue, philosophy now takes a quieter, more subtle turn. Instead of asking how humans recognize good and bad, some thinkers asked a more radical question: does evil truly exist on its own at all? Or is it something else entirely? This idea was most famously explored by Augustine, and it reshapes the entire conversation. According to this view, good is primary. It has substance, direction, and purpose. Evil, by contrast, is not a separate power competing with good. It is a lack, a distortion, or a breakdown of what should be there. Much like darkness is not a thing by itself but the absence of light, evil is understood as the absence of goodness where goodness ought to exist. Nothing new is created when harm appears. Something essential is missing. This perspective changes how we interpret moral failure. Instead of imagining evil as a force that enters a person, it frames wrongdoing as a movement away from wholeness. When kindness disappears, cruelty becomes visible. When truth is neglected, deception fills the space. The harm is real, but its nature is defined by what is lacking, not by what is added. One important implication of this idea is that the world does not need evil in order to function or make sense. Goodness does not depend on its opposite to exist. It can stand fully on its own. However, human awareness is often imperfect. We notice goodness most clearly when it fades, just as we become aware of health only after illness disrupts it. This does not mean illness is necessary, only that humans tend to recognize value through loss. This view also offers a different kind of responsibility. If evil is not a powerful external force, then humans cannot simply blame something outside themselves. Moral failure becomes a matter of neglect, misalignment, or refusal to nurture what is good. The focus shifts from fighting an enemy to restoring what is broken. At the same time, this idea challenges the assumption that contrast is always required for understanding. If goodness is real and complete on its own, then in theory, a fully aware mind could recognize it without ever encountering its absence. The problem is not the structure of reality, but the limits of human perception. So idea 3 gently reframes the debate. The question is no longer whether the world needs harm to define goodness, but whether humans are capable of seeing goodness clearly while it is still present. And that leads us forward, toward philosophies that question not just morality itself, but the way human consciousness learns, grows, and sometimes fails to notice what truly matters until it is gone. Moving forward, this idea builds naturally from the previous one and shifts our attention from what exists to how humans notice. If goodness can exist fully on its own, then why do people so often fail to recognize it while it is present? This question reveals something deeply human. Our awareness is not always aligned with reality. In everyday life, goodness often feels ordinary. Safety, fairness, trust, and peace quietly blend into the background when they are stable. They do not demand attention. As a result, humans tend to take them for granted. It is only when these conditions are disrupted that their true value becomes clear. Peace is fully understood after conflict. Trust is deeply felt only after betrayal. Stability becomes precious once it disappears. This does not mean loss is necessary in a cosmic sense. Rather, it exposes a limitation in human perception. People are more reactive than reflective. We respond strongly to disruption, absence, and imbalance, while harmony often goes unnoticed. Philosophers have long pointed out that this tendency explains why moral awakening frequently follows crisis rather than calm. Awareness arrives late, not because goodness was absent before, but because attention was. History reflects this pattern clearly. Societies tend to articulate values like justice, human dignity, and responsibility only after they have been violated. These principles were always meaningful, but they became visible when they were threatened. In this sense, loss functions like a spotlight. It does not create value, but it reveals it sharply. This idea carries an important ethical warning. If humans only recognize goodness after it fades, they risk becoming trapped in a cycle of regret. Appreciation arrives too late, and moral insight becomes reactive rather than proactive. Philosophy, then, is not simply about understanding why this happens, but about asking whether it must always happen this way. Some thinkers suggest that maturity, wisdom, and reflection can reduce this dependency on loss. Through attention and awareness, humans may learn to value goodness while it is still intact. Gratitude, moral education, and reflection serve as tools to sharpen perception before harm occurs. So Idea 4 does not argue that the world requires wrongdoing to teach lessons. Instead, it highlights a gap between reality and human awareness. Goodness does not need its opposite to exist, but human beings often need reminders to truly see it. The deeper challenge is whether humanity can learn to recognize what is good in the present moment, rather than understanding it only through absence, and whether moral growth can one day occur without the cost of loss. At this point, the discussion takes a more challenging turn. Some philosophers argue that while goodness may exist on its own, human growth often emerges from tension rather than comfort. This idea is most strongly associated with thinkers who believe that struggle plays a critical role in shaping character, meaning, and progress. From this perspective, difficulty forces reflection. When life flows smoothly, people rarely question their values or limits. Comfort encourages stability, but not transformation. It is resistance, internal or external, that pushes individuals to examine who they are, what they believe, and what they are capable of becoming. Without challenge, moral ideas may remain theoretical, never tested in real life. This view does not praise harm or celebrate suffering. Instead, it observes how humans historically respond to pressure. Creativity often arises in moments of uncertainty. Moral strength is revealed when choices are difficult, not when they are easy. Qualities such as courage, integrity, and responsibility gain depth only when they are exercised under strain. In a completely frictionless world, these traits might exist in name, but not in substance. There is also a psychological dimension here. Humans tend to discover meaning through overcoming something. Struggle creates narrative, and narrative gives life direction. Many people define themselves not by what they were given, but by what they had to face and respond to. In this sense, challenge becomes a mirror, reflecting strengths and weaknesses that would otherwise remain hidden. However, this idea comes with an important risk. If struggle is seen as valuable, it can be mistakenly treated as necessary or even desirable. Philosophers who explore this view often warn against that conclusion. Growth through challenge does not mean harm should be created or maintained. It simply acknowledges how humans, in practice, tend to develop awareness and depth. This raises a difficult question. Is struggle a temporary teacher, or a permanent requirement of human growth? Some argue that as human consciousness evolves, learning may rely less on hardship and more on reflection, empathy, and foresight. Others remain skeptical, suggesting that without resistance, motivation weakens and meaning fades. So Idea 5 does not claim that the world needs wrongdoing to move forward. It highlights a pattern. Humans often transform themselves when faced with difficulty. The philosophical challenge is to ask whether humanity can one day grow without needing to be pushed by conflict, or whether tension will always play a role in shaping who we become. Continuing from the idea of struggle as a driver of growth, some philosophers push the question even further. They ask what would happen if conflict, wrongdoing, and moral tension were completely removed from human life. At first glance, such a world sounds ideal, calm, predictable, and safe. Yet this idea challenges us to consider whether stability alone is enough to sustain meaning. In a perfectly orderly world, choices would rarely feel urgent. Moral decisions would be obvious, not demanding. When everything functions smoothly, humans may have fewer reasons to reflect deeply on values, purpose, or responsibility. Life might become efficient, but also emotionally flat. Without challenge, moral concepts risk becoming abstract rules rather than lived experiences. Philosophers who explore this concern do not argue against peace. Instead, they question whether human motivation depends, at least in part, on tension. When nothing is at stake, commitment can weaken. Curiosity fades. The desire to improve or to question existing structures may slowly disappear. Safety, while valuable, does not automatically produce wisdom. There is also a cultural dimension to this idea. Art, literature, and philosophy have historically emerged from moments of uncertainty and contradiction. Stories are shaped by conflict because conflict reveals character. Without moral tension, narratives lose their force. A world without contrast may still function, but it might struggle to inspire reflection or creativity. However, this argument walks a fine line. Saying that depth often arises from difficulty is not the same as saying difficulty should be preserved. Philosophers are careful here. The goal is not to defend harm, but to recognize a pattern in human development. Meaning, for many people, has been discovered through responding to challenges rather than through endless comfort. This leads to a critical question: is stagnation an unavoidable outcome of peace, or only a risk when awareness is low? Some thinkers believe that with higher levels of reflection, empathy, and education, humans could maintain depth without relying on conflict. In this vision, curiosity replaces struggle, and understanding replaces opposition. So Idea 6 presents a tension rather than a conclusion. A world without wrongdoing may offer safety and calm, but it also challenges humanity to find new sources of meaning. The real philosophical issue is not whether peace is desirable, it clearly is, but whether humans are prepared to sustain richness, purpose, and moral engagement once conflict is no longer the primary force shaping their inner lives. As the discussion continues, philosophy begins to shift away from conflict and toward consciousness. Instead of asking whether struggle is useful, this idea asks a deeper question: what if harm is not a requirement for growth at all, but a sign of misunderstanding? This perspective is especially strong in Eastern philosophy, where moral failure is often linked not to intention, but to awareness. From this view, harmful actions do not come from a need for opposition or tension. They arise when people misunderstand reality, when they cling too tightly to the self, to desire, to fear, or to fixed identities. The problem is not the presence of an opposing force, but the absence of clarity. When awareness narrows, compassion weakens. When perception becomes distorted, actions follow. In this framework, good and bad are not equal forces locked in balance. Goodness flows naturally from understanding, while harm appears when understanding breaks down. The solution, then, is not to manage conflict, but to reduce ignorance. Growth comes not from being pushed by difficulty, but from seeing more clearly. This idea challenges the assumption that humans must struggle in order to mature. It suggests that reflection, empathy, and insight can replace hardship as teachers. Instead of learning through loss, people could learn through attention. Instead of changing after damage occurs, they could change through awareness before harm appears. There is also a practical implication here. If harm is rooted in confusion rather than necessity, then preventing it becomes possible through education and inner development. Ethical progress would depend less on reacting to crises and more on cultivating understanding. Moral behavior would not require constant tension, only sustained awareness. However, this perspective does not deny reality. It acknowledges that ignorance is widespread and deeply rooted. Because awareness is difficult to maintain, harmful actions continue to appear. But this does not mean they are required. It means they reflect the current limits of human consciousness. This idea offers a quiet but powerful hope. It suggests that a peaceful world would not be empty or stagnant. It would simply operate on a different foundation. Meaning would come from connection rather than opposition, and depth would come from understanding rather than struggle. So Idea 7 reframes the entire question. The issue is no longer whether the world needs harm to function, but whether humanity can evolve beyond the level of awareness that produces it. If growth can come from clarity instead of conflict, then the future of goodness may not depend on contrast at all but on how deeply humans learn to see. As we move forward, philosophy introduces a sobering insight. Some of the most harmful outcomes in history did not come from people who saw themselves as cruel or destructive, but from ordinary individuals who stopped questioning their actions. This idea shifts attention away from dramatic wrongdoing and toward something quieter, yet more unsettling: thoughtlessness. From this perspective, harm does not always arise from strong emotions like hatred or anger. Instead, it often emerges when people act on habit, routine, or obedience without reflection. When individuals stop examining consequences, responsibility slowly dissolves. Actions become mechanical, guided by rules, roles, or expectations rather than conscience. This challenges the comforting belief that wrongdoing is always obvious or extreme. In reality, many harmful outcomes are produced by people who believe they are simply doing their job or following the system. The danger lies not in malicious intent, but in the absence of moral pause. When thinking is replaced by automatic behavior, ethical judgment quietly disappears. This idea also reshapes how we understand goodness. Being good is not just about having positive intentions or avoiding harmful labels. It requires ongoing awareness, reflection, and the courage to question what feels normal. Without this, even well-organized societies can drift into moral blindness, where harmful actions feel justified simply because they are common or accepted. Importantly, this perspective does not suggest that people are naturally dangerous. Instead, it highlights how fragile moral awareness can be. When comfort, routine, or authority replaces reflection, people may lose sight of the human impact of their actions. Harm then spreads not because people want it, but because no one stops to think. This idea connects deeply to the larger question of whether the world needs harm to understand goodness. It suggests that the real issue is not the existence of contrast, but the quality of attention. A world without awareness can produce harm even without obvious wrongdoing. Meanwhile, a world with strong critical thinking could maintain goodness without relying on suffering as a teacher. So Idea 8 delivers a quiet warning. The absence of obvious evil does not guarantee peace. What truly protects goodness is not perfection, but thinking, responsibility, and moral awareness. Without these, even calm and orderly environments can slowly lose their ethical foundation, reminding us that the greatest safeguard of goodness is not opposition, but conscious reflection. At this stage, the discussion reaches a careful balance. After exploring contrast, awareness, struggle, and reflection, philosophy arrives at a nuanced position. Goodness does not depend on harm to exist, but human understanding often depends on experience. This distinction is subtle, yet essential. Goodness, in itself, does not need wrongdoing as a foundation. Compassion, fairness, and care are complete concepts. They can exist fully without being challenged. From a purely philosophical standpoint, a world grounded entirely in goodness would not collapse or lose meaning by default. The problem lies not in goodness, but in human perception. Human beings are experiential learners. We tend to understand ideas deeply only after they are tested, challenged, or threatened. Values remain abstract until something forces us to confront their absence. Peace feels ordinary until it is disturbed. Trust feels invisible until it is broken. This does not mean harm is necessary, but it explains why awareness often arrives late. This pattern shows up repeatedly in personal life. People often recognize the importance of kindness only after regret. They understand patience after moments of failure. Moral clarity frequently follows mistakes, not foresight. In this way, The opposite of goodness acts less like a teacher and more like a signal alerting the mind to something it failed to notice before. Philosophers warn against drawing the wrong conclusion here. Just because understanding often follows contrast does not mean contrast should be preserved. Learning from loss does not justify loss. Pain revealing value does not make pain valuable. Confusing these ideas risks turning harm into a tool rather than a problem. The deeper question, then, is whether humanity can change its learning pattern. Can humans develop the ability to recognize goodness without first experiencing its absence? Can awareness replace reaction? Some argue that reflection, education, and moral imagination make this possible. Others remain uncertain, pointing to how deeply habit and experience shape understanding. Idea 9 does not settle the debate. Instead, it clarifies the tension at its center. Goodness is real and complete on its own, yet human insight often lags behind reality. The challenge is not to defend the existence of harm, but to shorten the distance between value and awareness. This idea prepares the ground for the final reflection. If goodness does not need its opposite, but humans often rely on contrast to understand it, then the future of morality depends on one question: whether human consciousness can mature enough to see clearly without first being hurt. Finally, we arrive at a conclusion that ties together all the previous ideas. Philosophers across cultures agree that while humans often learn about goodness through contrast, this does not give evil any intrinsic value. Harm, suffering, and wrongdoing are not tools to be used. They are challenges to be understood, addressed, and ultimately transcended. The focus shifts from asking whether evil is necessary to asking how humanity can respond to it. Recognizing the presence of wrongdoing, whether external or within ourselves, allows for growth, but only if we actively confront and overcome it. Moral awareness is not passive. It requires reflection, responsibility, and the deliberate effort to choose better paths, both individually and collectively. This idea emphasizes education, empathy, and self-awareness. By learning from past mistakes, cultivating understanding, and developing critical thinking, humans can reduce harm without depending on it as a teacher. Societies can create systems that protect fairness, promote compassion, and encourage ethical behavior. Individuals can practice self-examination and mindfulness, choosing actions that reinforce goodness rather than responding only to its absence. Importantly, this approach reframes the role of contrast. Contrast is useful for clarifying value, but it is not a requirement for moral action. One can recognize the importance of justice, kindness, and honesty without having endured betrayal, oppression, or cruelty. The challenge lies in developing awareness before harm occurs, rather than only after. In this vision, peace is not the mere absence of evil, it is the presence of proactive goodness. It is cultivated intentionally, supported by both personal reflection and social structures. While humans may never be perfect, striving to understand and overcome the roots of harm allows societies to move closer to lasting ethical balance. Idea 10 brings the philosophical journey full circle. Evil is real in human experience, but it is not an end in itself. Its significance lies in what it reveals about human perception, responsibility, and the effort required to foster genuine goodness. By understanding, recognizing, and consciously overcoming harm, humanity can create a world where peace is more than the absence of conflict. It becomes a product of awareness, choice, and enduring moral effort. And there we have it, our exploration of good, evil, and the way humans understand morality. What we have seen is that while evil and contrast often shape our awareness, they are not necessary for goodness to exist. Instead, true moral growth comes from conscious reflection, responsibility, and deliberate action. By recognizing and understanding harm, without letting it define us, we can cultivate a world where peace and goodness thrive not by chance, but by choice. Thank you for joining me on this journey today. I hope it has given you a new perspective on how we perceive right and wrong, and how awareness can transform both our inner lives and the world around us. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay curious, and remember that the path to goodness starts with awareness. Goodbye, everyone.